Just let council know we've just gone live on YouTube, so tell them. Yeah. 9 o'clock. I know Councillor Duffy's here, so we'll just pretend I don't. Okay, welcome everybody to this meeting on Wednesday, the 22nd of July for Council. Before we start, I'd like to welcome Melissa Brooks to our governance team. And looking forward to working with you, and I'm sure the councillors will make themselves known to you. Apologies. My apologies. Leave of absence. Councillor Kramer, you indicated leave of absence
From August the 8th to September the 6th. So available for 2-day workshop.
I'm happy to move that we see that leave of absence. Mr. Davis. All those in favour? Carries. Carried. Conflict of interest, item 3, are there any conflicts of interest that will be made clear in regards to the forum? No extraordinary or urgent items. Item 6 is the recommendation. The council confirms the minutes of the meetings held on 23rd of June and 8th of July as true and record of those meetings up on the board there. Councillor had to move recommendation. Councillor Scott, second Councillor Jesus. All those in favour? Aye. Against? Carried. So we'll move straight into the items on the agenda. First one under the reports, policy and strategy is item 7.1 on page 7 of the agenda, which is the Southern District rates and availability system.
Thank you, Your Worship and councillors. This report is really about using a tool to help you through your processes of policy reviews and budget review processes. So under the Local Government Act, we've got a requirement to sort of think about how the decisions that we make impact on community wellbeing, and in particular when we're making decisions about how we fund and rate, what impact that's going to have in our community. And so we've done some work in the past about trying to understand how affordable our rates are, or if there's any issues in our community. And this is trying to build on the work that we've previously done. So what we've done is completed an analysis. We've looked at aggregate levels of affordability, which is looking at our overall rates and understanding how do they sit, are they affordable, can people generally afford to pay them. So in doing that analysis, we've looked at households, we've looked at businesses in terms of GDP to get an understanding of whether there's issues in our overall rate level. We've also looked at what we call a distributional level, where we've gone in and looked at the different types of groups of ratepayers or parts of our community that, in terms of how we share out our rates, to understand if there's any issues within that approach as well. So the report sort of summarises, it's like quite a big report, obviously, and it works through to try and highlight where there are issues that may be a concern. I'm not going to go through the whole thing because I think you will all get a chance to read it and go through it, but I think I will just highlight what the key findings that we've taken out of it are, which are at that aggregate overall level. When we look at how our, the rates that our households pay, generally overall we're pretty affordable. So we had a benchmark that we've set previously at 5%, so the rate should be less than 5% of median household income. So when we look at a district level, we take the median household income and we take the median rate that a household pays in Southland District, and that works out at 3.95%. So we can take in conclusion from that at an overall level, that rates are pretty affordable. We've also done some analysis on GDP, which I should refer to the report pages that I'm talking about, which is on page 20 of the report. And so that was around looking at what do the rates that different industries pay in comparison to the GDP that those sectors produce. And council hasn't looked at this sort of measure before. This is a new measure. And so as a result, we haven't really set a threshold for that. But at an overall level, rates make up 2.1% of what is the model GDP for Southland District. So again, while we haven't set a threshold, 2.1%, in the layman's point of view, it's probably not unaffordable in terms of the proportion of products that they're producing and the amount, the proportion of rates that are being used in relation to what they're producing. So the conclusion that sort of I've recommended in the report is that generally at that overall level, rates, we could assume that rates are affordable based on those sorts of thresholds. However, when we look at a more aggregate level, distributed level, about how those rates are shared out with our community, that's when we do identify some issues. So the table that we've got on page 17 of the report, or it's separately attached as attachment B, I think that's where it's bigger. So that was looking within our community, the different townships and communities, where we might have some issues, where there's some differences within the year. And so the shading in that table gives you that idea of what the rates as a percentage of household income are in those different area units, what their income levels are, what their rates are, what the value of the properties are. And then we've added some new indicators in this measurement around deprivation. So again, if it's more of a highly deprived community, it's a darker shading colour. And then we've looked at proportion of properties that are on low income, proportion of properties in the area that have rates, rebates or accommodation supplement. So the accommodation supplement is the thing that the government gives you if you're struggling to pay for your housing costs. So we use that table then to sort of put further context around the rates as a percentage of household income and identify whether there's trends across multiple indicators in different townships. And so basically the outcome of that analysis suggests to us that inside of our townships there is looks like there could be some rate affordability issues. And that generally is caused by the fact that you have lower incomes in some of our communities, and you generally have quite a high service charge for things like rubbish, water, storage, which means that because we charge those on a fixed basis, they're all paying the same amount. So instead of being based on the value of their property, everybody's getting charged a fixed amount, which can tend to put up rates for low income or for low valued households. So, so in the discussions that we've had and thinking about, should we do anything about that, or does that matter? You know, we've got some recommendations for the report, which I'll talk a little bit about. And then also when we look at the GDP distributional analysis, so if we look at each sector's, each industry sector's share of GDP and their rates in table 2 on page 20. Again, there's some variations there in terms of portion of rates that each sector is paying in terms of GDP. So you can see agriculture, they're paying around 5% of their GDP is on rates. And the driver for that is really to do with the fact that they've got high capital values because they've got large land areas, and that drives higher rates than other sectors compared to commercial properties, which tend to be your local garage, which is on a smaller property, doesn't get the same sort of land area. So that table then, so while that table also gives an indication of within the industry area where we might have some tension as well. So we've sort of delved into that a bit more in the full report, and I guess there's some flaws with any sort of report like this in that, you know, we're reliant on what information we can find out about people's income and also what data we've got available. And so particularly with industry, it's really hard to get a feel for their income and, you know, like what a farm's income is, or what a particular industry's income is, because you can't get that access to that information. So to understand those further, we want to delve into, you know, what does that make up? What does agriculture? What are the actual incomes of farmers? And it's really difficult to get that information. So it's really high level at this stage, and it's an area that the best information we can get at this point in time. So in terms of what the findings of the report are overall, the conclusion is really that the main area focuses on those townships with low incomes and high rates, and I'll talk about who they are. And we've been discussing what could we do about that. And so the report talks a little bit about different options that we have in terms of either changing the way we do our rating to address those issues, and maybe shift the blend of rates from some sectors to others. And the problem with that, when you do that, it causes problems for other sectors as well. So you can't move one lever over here without it affecting someone else. And when we've got our industry data telling us that we're already tightening some of the agriculture rates, you know, if we do something here, it could actually push them even further from where they are. So we're cautious about that sort of approach. We could also look at the amount of money we spend and review our budget and expenditure, and that's a process that you'll be doing through the LTP. So that's not something that we'll specifically be looking at, you know, as a result of this project, but it's something that's going to happen as you go through your review of your long-term plan and your budgets and your decisions about your funding. The other option that we talked about in the report that we've said we should do some more investigation about is we could do offer a rate remission with people with low incomes wouldn't have to, you know, would have a rate remission for certain types of rates. So we've got some other councils in New Zealand that do that, and we thought we could investigate that a bit further and understand that whether that would make any difference in Southland, noting that already, you know, there's this tension about whether it's the government, whether it's our role to get involved in the sort of social, you know, addressing these social sort of issues in terms of income and income distribution. The government does that currently through the welfare support that it offers, the accommodation supplement, and also particularly through the rates rebate scheme, which is very much targeted to help low income households. However, it doesn't necessarily help everybody. It's only offered to people who are owned residences and things like that. So we're planning, as a result of this investigation, to do some more work on understanding whether that would be a useful tool, how it would work, you know, who it would help, and whether we should actually do that. So basically the recommendation for the report is suggesting that we look in that direction if we want to do anything at all. So yeah, I'm going to stop talking and open up for questions, or you can answer any questions.
Thanks, Nicole. Certainly, there's a lot of feedback on this. Are there any questions or comments, Councillor Harper?
Yes, thank you. Nicole, your graph on page 17 your medium household income, that is gross income, is that right?
There is, yes, it is, yeah.
It's gross income. So
Yeah.
it's really giving a bit of an unrealistic picture, I think, on the actual impact of the rates. We all know, by the time the IRD gets cut out of us, GST, that 46,000 for two and a half, 46,477 comes down to something like a real income of 30,000, which puts your rates up to around about 11% of your income, if it is income. So where do we go from there?
That's a question for you.
That's a big difference. Yeah.
I don't think the answer to that. So I guess it's a useful point. It would apply across the board to all of the incomes levels in here as well. So, and I guess the purpose of this report is to give you an indication of where there may be issues. Within a community, there's also going to be a great disparity. So these are, you've got to remember, this is the middle point household income. You're going to have some people that earn more than that. You're going to have some people that earn less than that. And so this is trying to indicate to you where there might be issues and where we might need to provide assistance. But it really, when you're dealing with redistribution issues, it's really hard. You really want to do that based on individual circumstances of individuals, because you're taking some people's money to pay for other people's problems. So it is a tricky issue to balance out those issues.
So through you, Mr. Chair, remember, of course, that you set the measure, and that measure was based on a Shand report, and it talked about gross income or total income for a household. So if you want to adjust for that sort of thing like tax, but then you start adjusting for everything else, then you can do so. But that's where that measure came from, and that's how we set that up.
I think that's the only way to do it. Otherwise, disparity for it's going to be even worse.
And recognise there are real limitations with data. This is based on what you put in the census. If I recall the census right, you're above 100,000. It's everybody, whether you're earning $5 million or $101,000.
Yeah.
So this is mass data collection for quite significant sizable areas of cohorts, groups of population. So it's a whole bunch of averages on averages on averages. And the only statutory requirement we have is to consider what's the impact of your renewed financing policy on the four well-beings of your communities. Any policy discretion which is suggesting there to look at having a remission policy as getting into individual case-by-case, complementing what government already does. And of course, it's income, it's not necessarily ability to pay in terms of wealth and the rest of it. It's got all those limitations around it.
It's definitely not a perfect model.
There is no perfect model, and you're not required to have a perfect model. You're not a social welfare or Department of Social Welfare MSD government policies complementing this framework. But you can get more involved in that, and obviously you've got to be prepared to. That's new expenditure you've got to fund. So that's the context within which you need to think about how far in this you want to go and how specifically targeted you want to get to with addressing individual affordability issues.
So in some ways, it's dangerous ground.
No, it's ground you can go into if you wish to. Just be aware of what you're doing, because the only statutory requirement in terms of this is consider the impact on the overall well-beings of the community. So it is recognised we are not an agency that has the data or are set up to resource to make individual case-by-case support assessments of need and all the rest of it. But we can absolutely, and we can justify it in terms of social well-being, do that if you wish. As Nicole says, there are 2 or 3 examples of councils that do that.
I think it's also worthwhile just pointing out that the Productivity Commission, when they did a review of council rating and funding, talked a little bit about councils and how they apply this role of, looking after the wellbeing and addressing affordability. And I guess the key finding of their report is they felt that central government is they have the primary responsibility for income redistribution. They know what people's incomes are. They have policies that they're trying to achieve in the social economic space. And so sometimes the Productivity Commission talked about if councils also start to work in that space and they're not aligned and they're thinking, then they can work against each other and you can get someone over here doing this and councils doing that. So you can, you know, it's up to you where you fall on that scale. But it's all, you've got to keep that in mind about, we don't know all the information, we're not probably best placed, so there are some limitations around that. And primarily that's what the central government's rates rebate scheme was designed to do. However, there are some holes in that scheme that the government is working through over a period of time.
Yes, Bob.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thanks, Nicole. Just you mentioned on page 20 that report which gives a breakdown of rates relative to GDP for different industries. Agriculture seems to be fairly fully rated up around that 5% level. With regard to, say, the tension and the cost of maintaining roads, could you clarify? I'm just looking at forestry, for example, at 0.8%, or transport at 0.4% of GDP. Why is there such a difference between those two and agriculture at 10 times that?
It'll just be the number of properties. So there's not as many forestry properties as there are in the south as there are farming properties. So as a result of that, the forestry properties don't pay as much in rates as a result of that. Yeah.
But it's a percentage of GDP, is it not?
It'll also be related to the capital value as well. So there'll be a difference between, like, so dairy farm properties have a much higher capital value than a forestry property per area. So because our rates are still on capital value, we'll also have relationships with quite a number of reasons that I'd need to also look at the different rate types that forestry properties pay compared to farming properties, because there'll be things like service charges that if you've got a farm and it's got a house on, it gets charged for certain things, with a separate use and inhabited part charge for things like walls and things like that, that a forestry property wouldn't get. But if you're interested in knowing more about that, I can do some further analysis.
Oh, I see. Okay, well, it just says here rates relative to GDP. So that's
So it's really about production of, you know, like forestry might be a relatively high producing. Forestry is mixed up with fishing, mining, utilities, so there's a lot of production in there, but they don't necessarily pay the same level of rates because of the nature of the properties that they've got and what's built on them and the size of them.
Yeah, I'm wondering if there's perhaps a bit of unfairness there. Agriculture, okay, so it's not actually GDP, but it seems significantly higher, the amount of rates that they're paying relative to other heavy industry who use our roads with heavy vehicles.
Yeah, and like we will be talking today at some point about the road rate model. So we definitely acknowledge that for that they do extra damage, and we specifically have a rating system that tries to reflect that, which we'll talk in more detail about today.
That's going to be the workshop.
Workshop,
Yes. That's going to be interesting.
Yeah,
Yes, thanks.
but I mean, it is an interesting point. I mean, GDP is basically the production from that particular sector. Now, how's that GDP measured?
Don't ask me about GDP. I'm hopeless GDP.
My view on this is it's very shaky area, and in fact I've had quite a robust discussion with Nicole about this, but it's one of those areas in which there are nobody else has worked out what the measure is, how to try and do this, and there are real limitations. I'd be very cautious about using this data in any great way.
So, yeah, I do.
But it was an intent to at least try and measure it.
Yeah, but I mean, it has highlighted a huge variation there against agriculture compared to the other sectors in forestry, which is a high producing sector. I mean, it's not as though that land is sitting there not producing, it is producing forestry each year. And I would have thought the GDP would be measurable and it would be significant, which would give it a percentage of rates versus GDP similar to another productive sector such as agriculture.
I think I do have in the full report the number of forestry properties, and I do think it's very much, we don't actually think that many. And the grouping of forestry, mining and utilities, you've got to remember utilities are in there like power companies and things like that, which will pay quite a high proportion of the Gs that will make up that, but they're not necessarily rated the same, to the same level. And it's, I guess, when they do this modelled regional GDP, they take national GDP figures and they try and they allocate it to Southland. So it's not perfect either. It's not, I guess the key, it's terrible to put a report up and say it's not perfect. But it's there for you to ask the questions. And so if you're interested in understanding more detail about, that proportion in agriculture versus other sectors, then I would do some more analysis into that and come back to that on that. That's important to understand that disparity.
Yeah, well, I think, what this report in front of us has done is highlighted a disparity. There's the agriculture is out of line with other sectors, and we need to understand why. Because on this basis of rates versus GDP, agriculture is paying over the odds.
And must say that's primarily driven by the number of properties that we've got that will be.
But that should even itself out. The larger the block, the more accurate the data should be.
This is where I come back to some of the stuff might be a wee bit dangerous as to how it's perceived outside as well. And I agree with you, it's a good report, but it's what the information we've got at the time.
It's an attempt to try and provide you with some information that we haven't had before.
Yeah.
And just like the income data, it's actually, the quality of the information is variable and reliant on what is available.
Councillor Duffy, Councillor Byers.
I just want to point out, I think we need to remember that includes the environment Southland rates, which in farming cases is higher than particularly dairy farming and forestry is likely to be. And also roughly half the farming rate is actually the targeted roading rate, which, is in recognition of that aspect. And the point about forestry, and I don't normally defend forestry, but their production isn't an annual production.
You should write it.
But I do see a lot of logging trucks on the road.
Well, you do, but
Again,
yeah, but I mean, off an individual property, it only comes once, and they say 30 years, it's probably more like less than 20, but still.
So I guess, unless there's any other questions, I'll put you back to the recommendation for the report and have a discussion about whether there is actually anything you would like coming out of it. And then we've suggested some further investigation to the rates motion, but if you don't think that that's a good idea, or if you'd like further information about some of the agriculture breakdown.
So Councillor Owen's got a question.
Well, my view is that this report has highlighted where we do have some people struggling with their rates, and I think that matches some of the anecdotal stuff that I've heard from individual ratepayers as well. And I can't see our rates going down in terms of council needs any time in the next few years, so it's only going to put more pressure on them. And so I think it's responsible of us to have you go ahead and do that work on looking at what those other options are for relief for those people.
Councillor Kerstin.
Thank you, Worship. In the report on page 17, the percentage of rate arrears is, it sort of matches where the a lot of the issues are with affordability, and so it's really that work that I know that the team does, but we just need to keep on working at that to try and get people to pay something early so that they are not in arrears and that's not another cost to them, so that they're only paying they need to pay, minimum of what they need to pay.
Okay, are there any other comments or questions? Right, you have the recommendation in front of you, recommendation 7.1 A to G. Councillor Kramer, seconded. In favour? Against? Carried. Thank you. Next item on the agenda is 8.1, the monthly financial report. 8.1.
Thank you, Your Worship, councillors. So this is the monthly financial report to the end of May. This is, in this report, the commentary is starting to reflect some of the impacts that COVID-19 has had. With some of the issues actually being coming through in the breakdown, with activity managers understanding, starting to understand it even now in June. So in terms of income for to the end of May, income was 2.9 million or 3% under projection. And this is occurred mainly in two areas, one of which was in relation to wastewater. We were under projection due to the phasing of the second block of money we were investing through our Ministry of Business and Innovation contract. We were entitled to receive that at the practical completion on the pipeline. Practical completion was completed literally on the 30th of June, so at the end of June we had issued that invoice through to MB and it will correct itself at the end. In addition, roading was slightly shown in the graphs. Roading is actually showing a slightly ahead of the annual plan number but under projection. And that was due to the additional work added in during the year for bridges and emergency work. And both of these items were split between 1920, the year we're talking about, and 2021, the year that we currently have. With various items, including COVID, we haven't quite got that split right for those two items. So there will be some of that will be occurring in 2021. In terms of operating expenditure, we're 3.4 million or 4% under projection at the end of May. A number of areas across the organisation under budget, particularly in the area of staffing and vacancies that are in situation. So these include customer service, information management, library services and finance as items that stand out. And this in some cases is due to the period of time it takes to replace a staff member. In some cases it's also roles have been considered as whether they're still required at that point. In addition to this, in district leadership, one of the items that the communications and engagement team have identified, while in the scheme of the world isn't particularly large, I think it's worth noting that they talked about first edition was unable to be published during lockdown and unable to be delivered. So it's one of the items that they had in this period. Also, people and capability had noted that the way they were running under projection, and that they expect that the full year result is likely to be closer to the full year projection due to the additional health and safety and staff costs through the COVID-19 period. Roading and footpaths at the end of May in terms of operational expenditure, general maintenance is under projection, which is due to reduced activity on the road, and the emergency reinstatement was running just over 400,000 under projection. So we're talking about a little bit earlier. In terms of capital expenditure, we are 3.7 million under projection at the end of May. The two most significant areas in there are roading program just right. Part of that is 200,000 of that is finalising the land purchasing on the Eternal Coastal Route. That is still ongoing. We are still waiting on a number of parties from landowners to finalise that process. The bridge renewal program is 965,000 behind forecast, and that was mainly due to some initial design delays and COVID-19. Progress is now being made, but we'll be making the budget at the end of the year. Streetworks is also under projection. This is in relation to footpaths, and this is made up of 3 projects that were delayed through COVID-19. The contracts have been awarded, but again, construction won't be completed by the end of June. Water supply is also showing a number of projects in there where there have been delays, including completion date for Tautau Mains to be now mid-July. The Tierra Waterman project hasn't been able to be commenced, and the UV disinfection at Riverton is working through a business case and proposal process to determine the most appropriate thing to be going on. In terms of roading, I've talked about it a couple of times through the report. Probably important to note for councillors that 1920 is year 2 of the 3-year cycle with ZTA, and we're now moving into year 3. New councils on the table, ZTA tends to work with a 3-year program, so we look to ensure we use as much of that funding process as we can within that triennial process. So year 3 will become more important and to make sure that spend it all we get as much as we can. The other item, which won't be a surprise to councillors, but I will note it on page 205 of the report is showing our investments. And the last lot of money we invested, we are getting principally some of 1.2% interest on it.
Okay, John.
Oh, yeah, bring it on.
Are there any questions from councillors?
Surprise.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We've been discussing a lot of stress as far as spending and pressure on the ratepayers. I'm just curious as to what these 3 conferences are. Conferences are fun. I've been to a few myself. Wondering if you have any information on those.
So I'm assuming Councillor Byers, you're referring to under communications and engagement, we refer to staff who are unable to go to 3 conferences. Again, are you able to comment?
This we also finalize the elderly website.
So they're all local government conferences. Thank you.
And I know there's been a large stoppage of conferences because of COVID, and what has been noted is that Zoom doesn't work all the time. You need to have those personal connections and personal interactions as well as presentations. So I know that our budget for that has dropped, but I'm sure that these conferences coming. I know that the most important one to at governance level is the AGM.
August 21st, rings a bell.
So although the numbers have dropped off, we can't push aside the importance of some of this.
In the investments, the 10 million that we talk about from the South Roads money, I don't see that here, or is that sort of detailed?
So yes, so the 10 million we refer to, which is, I think it's more like 8 now off the top of my head, is a reserve. And of course, the first call that we use with our reserves and our cash funds is we load it to other parts of the business in which fund work that they are completing. So this is effectively, rather than talking about reserves, we do have a lot of those, this is literally the cash we have going at any given point in time.
Mr. Chair, that cash is generally the rates for the 3 months. So it's not like it's a long-term money that we have on here. Often we'll be running those down over that 3-month period, waiting for the next
one.
It just highlights one thing, is that the minimal percentage interest we do receive, we do need to look at our monetary policies and create some more flexibility and opportunity. I think that's something that we still need to look at. So that sort of money invested at 1% is just absolutely ridiculous. So we need to look at different opportunities for our rate policy. I'm sure we have to have one of those.
Well, I know I just certainly support those comments that, we're operating in a completely different environment now, and what was fit for purpose, a few years ago is a completely different financial scene now, and I fully support that we need to review our financing policy.
So we'll get 2 comments to that. So how does that occur?
As I indicated yesterday, I was meeting in Wellington last week with actually a consultant who has some expertise in this area. Now, that might be able to help you work through quite a structured process to think about the structure of your balance sheet and all of the investments that you have, what's long-term strategic investments that you want to keep for a long time frame, such as the South Roads Reserve, and there has been some discussion about that in the past. Is it actually a long-term strategic investment that you want to look after generationally, and versus a short-term operational surplus or deficit that is kept there for purely operational purposes? So that is something that will get looked at in the LTP meetings, that we somehow need to find some time with you to work through and enable you to have a discussion on that policy context and what is an appropriate policies given the different uses of not only reserves, but as I said yesterday as well, you have forestry as being a long-term asset that is in fact, I think, inherited from previous councils, that you need to make it clear, is that the sort of business we want to be in, as well as other parts of your balance sheet, like assets or the fixed assets, significant fixed assets you have, and what are the requirements you have. So that's on our work program to work through with you in the next couple of months as part of the review and investment liability management policy.
And Councillor Davis and Councillor Kramer have got to fill you in.
One day, so it's just good to get that timetable.
Oh, I was just going to make a comment that the higher return has an element of extra risk that we've got to factor into.
And that's the other critical piece you need to remember is the different risk profiles of these different investments. And it's also about what's the maturity term of the investment. Is this something where you need the funding in 3 or 4 months when the next flood comes? Because it will. Or is it something that we're not going to need, we're going to lock away for the next 20 or 30 years, and therefore we can have absolutely quite a long profile investment time frame around. So those are the decisions that we'll work through with you and seek your guidance, and then obviously put it out for consultation with the community, because it does represent a change in the investment approach that this council's taken in the past, and you just need to be clear on what you're able to achieve and the risks, the ups and downs associated with that. When the next flood comes, when the next wave of COVID comes, and when COVID Mark 5, you name, comes as well, it changes the financial environment quite significantly as well. So all that will get worked through as part of that process.
I just have a request that when we do that work, that one of the portfolios that's included in that asset base is also housing, in terms of social housing as an investment, so that,
That's why I mentioned the whole balance sheet, because in fact we have $1.5 billion of public assets we look after here. Now the vast majority of that is in roads, and as we've talked about with the affordability of roading, and again this is coming right up with the activity management plans, we have not been maintaining our roads.
So are they an asset or a liability?
Well, good question. Good question that we'll be asking you to answer. Are they an asset? Are they still an asset that has a long-term future that is needed by our community, or has the need changed and we should be producing a different type of asset? That's the discussion here. That's part of your LTP, and you'll have that in activity management plans.
You can't lose sight through you can't lose sight of the large rural area. Our communities rely on those roads for their services, for their business, but also for their personal life, for emergency services, ambulance, fire, all those aspects. So the roads, like a lot of liability, are actually a very essential requirement for our communities. Something we can't lose sight of.
I think it was just a reference to how it sits on the balance sheet table. If it's
Just
money, it could be considered a liability. I don't think anyone's suggesting take the roads away.
So as the Chief Executive said, that will come down to some of our discussions. Planning process and very relevant discussions. Are there any other comments or questions around certain monthly financial report? If not, you heard the recommendation, we received the report. Councillor Owen, second Councillor Douglas. All those in favour?
Aye.
Against? Carried. April, I'm going to get you to do the minutes report. I'll just go back up a couple of minutes. Sure.
Go straight to the chief's report on page 47. So, Mr. Rue, speaking.
Okay, we have the report there, obviously highlighting Three Waters, given the announcement from the Prime Minister last week, I think it was, of a $791 million initial first phase investment into the Three Waters Reform Program. And obviously they're now starting to roll out nationally the workshops to discuss that across the sector. And I note that the Invercargill one, to which you will be invited, is here on the 30th, next Thursday next week. So hopefully you will manage to respond to that, and that will give you a good feel of the significance of the reform program that's proposed and what's involved with the accessing funding and putting buy into exploring the alternative service delivery models that we proposed and talked about. Obviously, a lot of work still to do in that space, but will be an important area to work our way through. COVID-19, obviously, again, they're just providing an overview of some of the funding that's been obviously dominating some of the headlines as government moves through okay, this very significant funding that's been set aside through the budget process. Now that again will come to an end, obviously, when we get into the formal election period. The fast track consumer bills now, in fact, an act now it's passed through, but doesn't directly affect us at the moment. There's 17 specific projects and there could be a limited range of those, but if it, in fact, will create significant work for us in the case if we do all those projects, because there is a requirement for our teams to respond very quickly to support the national process that goes through. And look, and I also reference here a couple of new conflict of interest guides that put out by the OAG. Encourage you to have a read of those at your leisure. Quite useful, more up-to-date documents in that space. So we could feel that the things to be aware of. And we're happy to take any other questions.
Open up for questions.
Just talking about the $90 million, and it's indicated there in the weeks they've already put money into the CBD. Have they got a date they're actually going to announce it?
So there was a heap of that last week. The $25 million for a tunnel, for example, I think is coming out of this.
That's part of it.
And there are a couple of other announcements as well. Those other Southland announcements are coming out of that regional money, as I understand it.
All the other one bucket. So.
And those two businesses that I am coming to details on.
TriStar,
Steve, just the three, Your Worship, the other members on this water committee, what roles do they currently hold? Are they chief executives like yourself, or?
The local government ones. The independent chair, Brian Hanna, is the former mayor of Watersound District. Rachel Reese is mayor of Nelson. Alex Walker is mayor of Central Hawke's Bay. Baden Barber is Hastings councillor. Stuart Crosby's councillor Easton is the LGBT vice president and councillor at the front of that 30. Vaughan Payne, Monique, Pat Doherty, Hamish Riak, Maria and Ed Shopper are the other chief executives. And then Alistair Cameron and Craig McElroy are both from Waterkey and Waterfield.
I just questioned the comment about the Taonui wastewater plant, project, and it talks about the staff being progressing on a number of fronts, including development of resource consents. Those resource consents are all in place now, are they?
Through you, Your Worship, there are a number of minor resource consents that will be required throughout
It's reflective predominantly of the major consent around the extension to the water discharge consent that is yet to be processed by Environment Southland. It's been lodged and accepted. We need to have a determination around the notification status of that particular consent, and we're anticipating that in the coming weeks.
Mr. Myers.
Just the dark skies plan for Rakiura, just to comment on that, I wonder if anyone else has noticed the satellite trains moving through the skies. I'm getting a few, I've seen them, 25 I counted, string of satellites, and astronomers around the world are starting to get a bit concerned about the light pollution. If you're a fan of the stars, yeah. It's a bit disappointing. No, but I mean, regards to dark skies, it might have an impact on how well you see your stars.
For opportunities.
Oh yeah, that's a star. Look at it.
Shooting stars.
Okay, any other comments, questions around the management report? I'm happy to move the report as a second. Councillor Taylor, all those in favour? Against? Next item on the agenda, 8.3, earthquake liability consultation on page 2. Everybody's going to present.
Good morning. Thank you for your time today. It is my pleasure to introduce this topic of earthquake-prone building consultation for the Southland District Council. I have with me Lindsay Philp. Lindsay is our quality assurance lead here at Council. She works across the environmental services group. And Lindsay has put a lot of heart, time and soul into this report, so I will ultimately let her present it. Essentially though, whilst we at Council have quite a role to play regarding earthquake-prone building identification and following that through over the next up to 25 years to resolution, we recognise quite significantly that some of these buildings are utilised by the community in a way that we couldn't possibly know because we're not out in the community. And so this particular consultation is enabling our community to have a voice and a say as far as the nature of earthquake-prone buildings is concerned. So for me, this is a real positive step for Council, and I'm actually really delighted that we're at this point of presenting this to Council for your approval and recommendation. So I'll hand over to Lindsay now to present this for you. Thank you. So one of the questions that we were asking of you is the dates of the consultation. We hope to kick these off around the 10th of August. But before I get to that, I just want to give you a little bit of context around the documentation that you have. I know you've got a lot of documentation, so this will just help give a wee bit of context around that. You'll notice that in 2017, the legislation changed around earthquake-prone buildings, and ultimately that was done so there was consistency across the country in the way councils deal with these types of buildings. Now, you've got two handouts in your pack, two maps there. New Zealand was divided into 3 seismic risk zones. One of the maps will give New Zealand and the other is specific to Southland District Council. The red represents the high seismic zones. The yellow is the medium and the green is the low seismic zones. SPC, we're really lucky, we've got all 3. Page 232 in your documents. But at the moment we're concentrating on the medium seismic zones, and that's where we want to carry out our consultations. Now we've identified, so basically what happens is after the new legislation came out, council went and they identified a number of possible earthquake-prone buildings in all of these areas. And based on that, we were able to come up with a number of thoroughfares in 5 areas. So that's Winton, Wyndham, Tautau, Riverton, and Tuatapere, where we need to undertake public consultation. And as Julie alluded to, we need the public's help in identifying how they use those buildings. So, for instance, we could have a secret burger establishment in Wyndham, where we don't realise that 3 nights a week a number of people will gather in and around that area, which may also contain earthquake-prone buildings. And so there is a higher risk to life and property. So if they're parking their cars out the front, if they take their bicycles there may be an additional risk to them. And that's the piece of the puzzle that we want to obtain through the consultation. We need to understand how they're using those areas, how they're socialising around those areas. You know, there could be a bus stop in one of those thoroughfares that picks up and drops off 50, 60 people at any given time who may be hanging around those areas that may have considerable risk to those people. So the consultation will help identify that. Once we have undertaken the consultation, we then have to look at the information that we have gathered, and we need to apply in these very strict criteria, and we need to start identifying buildings that might create a higher risk, and these may become what we call priority buildings. So the first stage for us to do, for us to manage that, is to send letters to any identified property owners and ask them to provide us with an engineer's report within the period of a year. Once we have that, again, we have to compare that with these strict criteria, and those buildings may be deemed either earthquake-prone or priority buildings. And the difference between the two is any building that is deemed a priority building will have, in the medium seismic area, 12.5 years to rectify the issues. And if it's just an earthquake-prone building, they will have 25 years to manage that. So we want to start our consultation on or around the 10th of August and complete it on around the 30th of October. So we want your opinion on what you think about those dates. And I can answer any question. Hopefully I'll try and answer any questions. I'm not an expert, but I do have a general knowledge. If you've got any questions in and around it.
Thank you. Any questions from council? Councillor.
So these buildings, how have they been identified? And so have we had our engineers just visually drive past these buildings, say that's potentially at risk, therefore we're going to send a letter to that owner to get him to get an engineer's assessment to either confirm or deny that it's a risk?
So council have taken the criteria from MB based on age of the building, how many levels it is, and if it has unreinforced masonry. Yep. So that's the first stage. That's what we've done as a council. We've gone out, done that. We've looked at the buildings on a sort of a paper level, if you like, and we've also gone out and got pictures and confirmed that those buildings are what we suspect they are. And that was the first stage. When we see a group of those buildings in an area, so it's usually the main streets, then we start to ask ourselves, is this a greater risk to the people in the community because of the types of shops and the way that those areas are being used? And that creates our thoroughfares, and that's what we want to solve.
Just further, Your Worship, so the owners of these buildings will receive a letter
Yes,
And the letter's going to say, please get an engineer's assessment within 12 months.
yes.
What is that likely to cost? And is there a carrot, is there a stick to ensure that this report is completed?
Okay, so this is driven by legislation. The cost to the building owner can vary depending on the size of the building and the type of the building. I've seen costs anywhere from 5,000 to 30,000. That's being realistic because the engineer's report has to be, it has to meet a certain criteria as well. Again, it's depends on the size and the type of building that it is. Carrot and stick, you know, at the end of the day, this legislation came out to protect people. We had Christchurch, people lost their lives, people were injured. So the carrot is that we're protecting the people within the community from that happening.
Okay, that's fine. Okay.
Councillor Darcy, Councillor Boyd.
So in the case of a building that was earthquake prone, but the owner has since strengthened it, is that, will those people get a letter, or has that already come through?
That will already be through an record. So some people have chosen that they didn't want to live in this world of not knowing, and they went out themselves and they got engineers report and they provided those to us, and we've been able to classify the buildings appropriately. So if we look at the high level, although we didn't give consultation because the buildings didn't create a greater risk, the Monowai Power Station, they went out and did that. They realised that they had issues. They changed the way they use the building, so it's no longer manned, and they strengthened it. So we won't require them to go out and get another engineer's.
And if I may, so we talk about Wyndham, in the neighbouring township of Edendale, there's 1 2-story building on the main corner, which there has been some anecdotal talk around the community about its worthiness or whatever. Would it be wise to include that?
That's a really good point. So I've taken my information from our building team who have been assessing all of these buildings. It's certainly a question I'll go back and ask. We tried to capture as many as we could. Some people would look at some of the areas and go, I'm not sure whether you should even do a consultation. But we are trying to err on the side of caution. So I will have a look at that specific building.
If I may add to that, the evaluation that's already taking place within council is on the individual building itself. This particular consultation is around thoroughfares. So that's your groups of buildings that we believe contain potentially earthquake-prone building stock. So for example, in our High area, we have Tiana. A lot of the thoroughfare of Tiana was built after the dates that typically these style of buildings were built. And when we completed our evaluation through there, that name thoroughfare didn't contain the earthquake-prone style buildings. They were only a structured building. So that's where that consultation wasn't needed in the high zone. In the medium risk zone, whilst we're not aware of thoroughfares of buildings that are being used at a high foot traffic, for example, that's where we need the community input. So this consultation, whilst it's been refined to concise possible thoroughfares of high foot traffic, does not change that each individual concise building that's identified as potentially earthquake prone will need to go through that process of having an engineer's review and report. And it is council who hold the obligation of following through on that, making sure that that report comes back to council within the 12 months of the date issued. And then making sure that the outcome of that report is followed up with a clear identification that goes on the property record of whether or not that is then considered an earthquake-prone building, and the ongoing follow-up for the next 12 and a half, right through to 25 years, of ensuring that that rectification work happens or the building is removed. So this is the start of quite a long journey for council, where we do hold accountability to keep that follow-up. So I would hate to think of us as a stick, because I too totally agree with what Lindsay said. This is about our community safety. This is about giving them assurance that the areas that they live, work and play are safe for their children and their children. And so we do take that very seriously.
Councillor Vice, Councillor.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Well, you've answered one of my questions was why we were starting with the medium density and not the high density. Some of these buildings will be heritage buildings, and you've alluded to the expense of getting these reports done. I seem to recall, was there some funding available for the building owners?
So heritage buildings still live within the legislation that protects them. And there is funding available that kind of comes and goes depending on the time of the year. Our view is that we will put all this information up on our website so people can link through that and they can access that. There's also various appeals and extension of times that people can go through on an individual basis as well. And I believe heritage buildings are entitled to an extension of time, but they have to meet a certain criteria. I actually met with an expert in this area just this week because there is actually strength to our community if they get together and they choose to collaborate and propose multiple heritage buildings under the same pocket of work. And so we are engaging with the experts in this field to be able to very clearly and concisely educate and engage with our community and enable them to follow this process through. So there's certainly a lot of work coming in that space for that.
Thanks for that. It kind of links in with what I was going to ask. I'm just thinking about communities like Ōtautau particularly. You might have particularly a lot of absentee land owners as well who are not going to be around and engaged in those processes. It's going to be quite difficult to get that collective response, although that would be ideal for a situation of a township like that, which has an awesome collection of old buildings. But also, other than those with heritage buildings, there's a lot of not-for-profit organisations as well who may not have a heritage building as such, but their funding, so they typically, particularly now in this current environment, will not have $5,000 to $30,000 sitting there ready to spend on this sort of thing. And their funding application timeframes are often quite long. Often they're waiting for 6 months for a particular fund to open. So my request would be that we can build in some information for those guys as well into what their funding options are and explain some leniency that can around what the timeframes are, because that can be very stressful for them to think that they're going to be, they'll be going, we're going to be kicked out of our building in a year's time if we don't do this. And it's not really fair, I don't think, in a short time frame to land that on them.
I agree. The absentee landlords is a big cause for concern. We're trying to address that by sending out a letter to owners of all the buildings in those identified authorities, just to say, heads up, we are doing a consultation, please be engaged in the affect your building, in order just to try and get them to have a look at what they want to do. Unfortunately, we don't have any control over that and what they decide with the buildings.
Thank you, Worship. The period of consultation, 10th of August to the 30th of October, seems to me to be quite a long time. I'm wondering if, like what are we proposing, sort of that element of, I must get on and do that, but it drifts and you lose the impetus if you're not doing it straight away.
So the thinking behind that, I think the minimum is 6 weeks, if I remember correctly. We are working within 5 different areas, and so it's not just people that live in those areas, it's the people that commute through those areas. So we want to get the message out to anybody who shops in those areas, the trucker that stops at the bakery every day, and engage as much of the community as we can. That was the thinking.
Just in relation to those owners of heritage buildings,
certainly there was a lot of interest in the meeting that was held at Winton a couple of months ago. And I'm just wondering if the letters you sent out to others, there was a link to that information. So owners had the opportunity to look at that before coming to those consultation meetings, and at least pick out there and obtain information early on what they may do and link in with each other to make those costs.
Absolutely, we want to make it as transparent as possible. Having been the person that's waded through all of this, I absolutely understand some of it's not easy to find, so we bring that to the surface and allow them to do investigations. And I think that probably feeds into your question too. You know, even though it's not a surprise, people should be aware that this is coming. There is a lot of reading to do about it, and there's a lot of information out there. So we want to force people through to the correct websites, the government websites, and ones that are going to give them correct information about. Some of them may want considerable research.
So I think that's an important point that Lindsay's just made. Whilst we are going to enable our community to have the right information, we need to be very careful not to truncate the information that they make their informed decisions on. So we need to ensure that that's available for them. We need to answer questions and guide them into the correct areas. But we are going to, the intention is to do that in an approach that enables that source of truth that created this legislation and enables the application of this legislation to be that source of truth. We don't want to undermine that information. So there still will be, for the owners of these buildings, quite a lot of research and reading to do so that they are well informed. And yes, we are able to support that process the best we can, but we are going to be very careful not to summarise that to the point that if we miss something, we affect their ability to make a full informed decision.
I appreciate that. It was really valuable having that representative from
I'm just curious about because this is drafted by central government legislation, and when they're doing that, they're thinking about thoroughfares like Wellington, Christchurch, places like that, those sorts of volumes of traffic around thoroughfares. Our towns, by comparison, are much more minor, less than a week than what there would be in a day in some of those places. So what's the government criteria around that?
So yeah, I actually, when I read this, I felt the same that this had originally been designed for larger communities. With the MD's guidance, we were able to drop part of the consultation, which was around emergency vehicle access, because of the way our buildings are and the alternative routes, and the fact that most of our communities are in a country setting. However, we can't underestimate that we do have a lot of heritage buildings, a lot of old buildings, a lot of buildings, you know, with that pretty unreinforced masonry on them. So I feel it's a benefit to those communities to undertake the consultation rather than this is something we have to do. I think, I'm from the district, so talking to people, they all come up with, oh yeah, there's this building, the church uses this building, and we do this at that building. So it's people start to get them thinking about that, and we have an obligation to protect the community in those smaller towns, just as in Wellington, and Cardiff City and so forth.
I said one, that's in relation to 18. I know that the costs and staff time have been covered through the building solutions to deal with earthquake prone. In the meantime, we've got all these consents and everything coming in. Got new buildings to build as well. We need to keep that capacity and capability. As the chief executive going to come on staff to do both these projects. But Councillor Crane might be asking this question for a while. We need to make sure that South is still progressing while identifying that there could be a risk of as well.
certainly, I think best place to answer that one. We have been doing a lot of evaluation of how we're tracking to date. And we've had a lot of community feedback that the way that we're currently structured, which is a heavy reliance on contractors, is not working well for our community. As part of my preparation for the activity management planning process, which feeds into our long-term plan, I've had a look at how we've structured that and intend to workshop that with our ELT tomorrow and bring a solution to this committee in the near future to say that what we're doing is not working well for our community. It's not sustainable. And I do believe that there is a change needed, a change that should come soon. There are obviously options as to how we change and what we change. And so those options I really want to work through with our executive leadership team and make sure that the recommendation that comes to council is fit for purpose and appropriate for this council.
We realise this work needs to be done as well.
I think alongside what Julie's already said is, I think, working with Jock and his team to automate this process or have an electronic process that will help us follow this through, because there is lots of little streams that can come off this with people being able to appeal and request extensions of time because of the length of time that this will carry on. So we are putting in place a system using existing computer systems that will make that a little bit easier for us to do and maintain.
Just one final comment. In regards to this, there are some strict deadlines that we are sticking to. The minute you miss a deadline, they are coming down to visit and check exactly what's going on.
That's the stick.
Yeah, that's the stick of that stuff. That obviously the legislation is coming out.
Appreciate that. Thank you. Any other questions from council in regards to that? Okay, you have item 8.3 in front of you. There have been amendments. The chief executive and have been working on that to part D, and that's to just change that wording to agree to the statement proposal. And determines the consultation on the background buildings commences to, rather than having a word in principle. So is there a councillor having a move recommendation as on the screen up there on councillor Menzies? Seeing that, councillor Keith, all those in favour?
Aye.
Against, carried. Thanks for the work on that. We look forward to comments on that. Next item on the agenda is page 237, 8.4, disposal of land adjoining 29 Street.
Good morning, Your Worship and Councillors. The residents at 29 Springfield Street, Winton, access the property via a bridge located on land owned by council. The bridge is in a state of disrepair and council had intended to stop use of the bridge in the near future. The new owner of the bridge has agreed to pay the subdivision and legal costs to subdivide the area and therefore allow ownership of the bridge to be transferred to them. We seek a reservation that the land where the bridge is located is surplus to requirements and therefore be transferred to the owner of the Springfield. I also apologise for referring to a recent community board as the Winton Community Board. And I'll have it. Have you taken questions?
Thank you. Any questions from councillors? What's that?
Yeah, no question, but
And so so the bridge, is that one that we were going to place? Was that on our asset register? Good. No, I think this is a very pragmatic solution, and I'm happy to move.
Moved by councillor Douglas, seconded by councillor Crump. Oh, yes. On F, delegates to the chief executive the authority to execute any necessary. It's not executive, any necessary. Yeah, with that change there, councillor Davis.
Yes, certainly.
All those in favour?
Aye.
Against? Carried. Colin, go for it.
Result no. No,
Next
that's-
item on the agenda is the health and safety update on.
Oh, look, I'm not sure where Miss Alice is, but I'm happy to take the report as read, just give you an update and answer any questions.
Councillor Menzies.
I just note on the report that there are, but there are a couple of items in terms of the plan that have had to be moved forward because of lack of completion. Is that due to a resource issue, and does that have an impact on completion of other work under that health and safety banner?
Well, certainly our health and safety resource, in fact, our resource generally is stretched with COVID and floods and other things that happened this year unexpectedly, which has delayed routine planned work. But if there's a couple of specific items referring to, we try and answer those.
That was just generally,
Yeah.
it's not really a difficult one to.
I know one of the ones was that survey, some council have been involved in that survey, the health and safety survey. So, yeah, so I know that happened post-COVID, I think Councillor Kramer himself.
But I noted in your report, the chief executive report, that the
Yes, so
COVID-19 on health and safety, and how that is being addressed, I guess, in this plan and future dates for completion of set pieces of work.
You happy with that?
Oh, nice.
Councillor Owen.
Just on page 250, the updated plan, it's got on there ongoing work being done by Bruce Halligan, but he's no longer an employee. So.
That's the next item.
Yeah, health and safety. Oh, is it?
Good health and safety report.
Oh, okay, sorry.
That's okay.
yeah, and it actually reflects that this was last year's plan when he was here rather than the new plan for next year. That's why he's there. He was here when that plan was approved 12 months ago.
Sorry, I was not here.
No, we're taking
Taking the reporting as taking the report as read.
There was a question around some of the.
Okay, great. So we're doing the update or the health and safety plans?
No, we're still on
Sorry.
the,
The health and safety update? Sure.
so are there any other questions around the update on?
Happy to move the recommendation.
Councillor Kramer, seconded. Councillor Fraser, all those in favour?
Aye.
Next item is 1.1 on page 247 of the draft health and safety plan.
Good morning, councillors. Okay, so with the paper this morning, I have a draft health and safety plan for 2020 to 21 that has the proposed objectives for the year ahead. The plan was presented to the Finance and Insurance Committee and on June 22nd of June 2020, and they have provided their endorsement of the plan for council's consideration and approval. For your information, one of the key points of the plan is the implementation following a draft health and safety audit. So it's only a slight section in the bottom of that will form part, a big part of our plans for 2021. Once we receive that report and we continue with the implementation of that.
Thank you.
Happy to answer any questions anyone's got.
There was a question from Councillor Owen in regards to what Bruce Halligan's name was on there. It's been answered. but
Yes,
the old-
that's to do with last year's. Yes.
Any other questions in regards to this? Not, is there a councillor? Councillor Scott. Seconded. Councillor Ransford, all those in favour? Against? Carried. Thank you. Next item on the agenda is the appointment to the Milton Community Trust, page 203 of your agenda. Okay, thank you, Your Worship. Mr. Moran's absence, asking to present this report. Very much a procedural report. The report covers the process that is required to be followed for the appointment of trustees as per the trustee and 2 vacancies and 2 nominations. So just happy to take any questions. That was the procedure on that. Any comments, Councillor?
No, this support. We've decided that 2 vacant positions and we've got 2 people. For those vacancies, I'm happy to move those.
Thank you. Is there a second? Councillor Davis. For those in favour?
Aye.
Right, so we're going to move into public excluded for the reasons contained in the agenda in relation to scope of land and unapproachable expenditure. And we've got another start behind. I'm happy that we move into public excluded. Is there a second? Councillor Matthews. All those in favour?
Aye.
Against? Carried. So we turn to YouTube off and stuff.